Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Without any background music, because the computer's being finicky, here's Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid. Wow.
Well, I mean, it is.
Yeah.
Sitting here just watching spin and spin.
I'm getting voice back at myself, Bob. I don't know whether that's part of it.
I don't know, but I'll go away and then you won't.
I'm hearing okay.
Wait, you're hearing yourself?
I was hearing myself, not now.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Knock 'em dead.
Thank you, Bob. Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. On this Monday, today is the 26th day of October. It is the last week of October in the year 2015. It is a pleasure to be with you on this, our first day of broadcasting here at the Virtual Center of an entirely brand new week. I apologize for the fact that we're starting 3 or 4 minutes late today. Bob and I were chatting, and we kind of lost track of the time. And Bob finally said, "I love our conversations, but we've already talked our way through 5 minutes of the program already." So I apologize for being late. It's entirely our fault. And I didn't know about the background music not being available today. But be that as it may, we're here. And we have a program I do believe that you will find both interesting and informative. I hope so. And by informative, I just don't mean information for purposes of knowing it because it's interesting. But I'm hoping that some of what we cover today will be beneficial in helping us to grasp fully the implications of some of the issues that are confronting us today. I think, not to get into this because it clearly would be a side issue, and I don't want to get sidetracked, so to speak. But there's absolutely no question that the value of much of what we do, the value of history, I believe, is the ability to understand the circumstances which produce certain results, so that when situations occur in your lifetime that seem to be taking similar shape, then we can anticipate with some degree of accuracy the kinds of things that might happen. And if they are negative, theoretically, we can intervene in time to do something about it. The whole idea of learning from our mistakes of the past, I think, is part and parcel of this. So I hope that what we'll be looking at in today's program will be helpful in this way. I want to thank you for being with us. I do want to encourage you to participate even more actively than simply tuning in by sharing your thoughts, your ideas, questions, concerns, observations, whatever, with us, not only with me, but with other people who are tuned in. Our phone number, and this will get you on the air. You'll go through the studios and probably talk to Bob Kincaid, who will immediately let me know that you're there, and we'll get you on the air as quickly as we can. The phone number is area code 304-663-467. Excuse me. I got the wrong. I'm giving you the wrong number. 4676, that's correct. Area code 304-663-4676. I say that number so frequently that I assume I just know it, and something didn't seem right today, and I kept thinking, well, I'm sure that's the right number. But anyway, it is. 304-663-4676. And as we know, on your keyboard, your keypad on your phone, 4676 is HORN, HORN. If you'd like to communicate directly with me and share your ideas, I would love to hear from you. And I do believe that, if they appear to be ideas or information or observations that our listeners would enjoy hearing and could benefit from, then I do request your permission to share these with our listeners on a future program. I wouldn't violate your confidence or who you are or anything else. So, if you don't want me to identify you at all, then just indicate that in your email, and I'll be glad to extract the information without giving our listeners any idea who basically is responsible for the particular ideas in question. I do encourage you to visit our Facebook page. If you go to Facebook and type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, that will take you to our Facebook page. I posted a couple of things toward the end of last week on the Facebook page in anticipation of our program this week, because those of you who were with us last Wednesday will know that we began looking at the period when the Constitution became law of the land with ratification in 1788, 1789, and the inauguration of President Washington in March of 1789, and his immediate duty, if you will, to appoint executive officers in his administration. And as we know, the two predominant names in the Washington administration, other than Washington himself, are, of course, his Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, and his Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson. And the appointment of Thomas Jefferson is what brings Jefferson from France back to the United States after representing the United States in the courts of Europe through the late 1780s. We also know that that Secretary Jefferson, as the differences between himself and Alexander Hamilton became more and more pronounced through the early years of the Washington administration, finally Jefferson resigns as Secretary of State in 1793. And as we know, the emergence of the Second Party, which is well underway by this time, continues apace through the early into the mid and late 1790s, to the point that Jefferson becomes the head of the alternative party, which is formed during the 1790s, which we know from our textbooks to be the so-called Jeffersonian Republicans. And they are able to elect Thomas Jefferson as President of the United States in the election of 1800. So that's the period we're looking at. We began looking at this issue of the Washington administration, looking principally at the perspectives of the evolution or the development, if you will, of political parties in the early years of the nation. And we began that process in our last program when we were last together this past Wednesday. But I do want to go back and revisit some of that with you, and I really believe that a careful look at Hamilton's program and recognizing or considering it to be just that, a program with several different facets. I'll share a few pieces of specific information in that sense with you in a moment, which will give you an idea of exactly how this was indeed a program. And what I mean by that is each part of it is connected to the other part. And I think that this is particularly significant. In other words, the major elements of what becomes Hamilton's program are not isolated, freestanding financial recommendations by any means, but all of it is part of an overall plan, which I think if one is in any way going to defend or to support Hamilton as Secretary of State and the wisdom or the vision that is reflected in his program, then it seems to me one must first of all recognize that indeed it is a program. It has various parts, and all those parts indeed do connect. And it's the connection of those seemingly isolated elements or different elements that make for a program which is worthy of analysis and worthy of understanding. And that's the point that I was making early on about the fact that once we are able to do this, and once we are able to recognize and understand the interconnectedness of the various elements, of the various aspects of Hamilton's program, we can begin to understand the nature of a political vision or insight which suggests a major approach to government as we know it. And then seemingly we ought to be able to transfer that particular insight or that particular understanding into other eras, other periods of the past, and indeed into the present. I think that in reviewing some of this material for today's program, one of the issues that struck me, just as an observation, was the extent to which this stuff is so relevant in today's political world. I think that one of the things that struck me particularly was that as we look at the campaign and look at some of the speeches of Senator Sanders, Bernie Sanders, for example, we look at the role of the Clinton administration, and we look at the competition for the Republican nomination, we begin to see within our evolving or emerging two-party system in this country many of the same issues and many of the same differences, if you will, that seem to separate our candidates and parties. So I think understanding those issues really can go a long way, and that's what I'm hoping the overall benefit, the overall outcome of today's program will be. So again, please feel free to participate and share your thoughts, your ideas. Once again, since I messed it up the first time, I want to give you the phone number. You might want to jot it down so that if you do indeed get the urge to use it, it'll be right there for your use. The number is area code 304-663-4676. One of the things that I found interesting, I mentioned a few moments ago that obviously the key appointments in Washington's administration were the appointment of Jefferson as Secretary of State and Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury. Many of us also are aware that there are other appointments in the Jefferson administration as well. One of them, for example, is the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. And I don't know how many people recognize this, but the first Chief Justice appointed by President Washington was John Jay, who, as many of us will know, was one of the three authors of the Federalist Papers in New York in the 1780s. I think it's understandable and indeed predictable that President Washington would go to Hamilton in New York, who was an author of the Federalist Papers, and his colleague John Jay as the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And, of course, one of the first pieces of legislation passed by the first Congress under the Constitution is the Judiciary Act of 1789, which lays out the parameters, the structure of the court as laid out in the Constitution of the United States. All that the Constitution says is that there will be a Chief Justice and as many associate justices as Congress will determine. So that's basically the invitation that the Constitution extends to the first Congress to fill in the gaps or fill in that outline by coming up with what is called the Judiciary Act of 1789. One of the things that I think is interesting, and I think we'll see this is going to be particularly relevant. It's not often mentioned, but I think it's particularly relevant. I think it basically says a whole lot. Is Jefferson as Secretary of State? Early on, there was no post entitled Secretary of State. Rather, the position in question was entitled the Secretary of Foreign Affairs. But early on in the Washington administration, there is a debate about the nature of government itself under the Constitution. Of course, this is just an ongoing conversation that existed prior to ratification itself, and once the new Congress comes into office and begins to function as a Congress, then this same conversation obviously continues. And one of the issues that comes up is the role envisioned for the new government under the Constitution. And almost from the get-go, from the very beginning, there's a difference of opinion that emerges within the administration over the proper role of government. Basically, what we're talking about is how visible, how active, how aggressive, or how dynamic, if you will, the federal government will be under the Constitution. Remember that in order to get the Constitution ratified, it was necessary to make substantial compromises with those who opposed it, the Anti-Federalists. And of course, the major position, or the fallback position of Anti-Federalists, of course, was the Articles of Confederation, namely state sovereignty under the Articles of Confederation. The major shift that ratification produced in the country was the transition from a confederation, a league of friendship, quoting the words directly from the Articles of Confederation, a league of friendship comprised of free and independent states, to a constitutional union under a federal government. By definition, that meant that many of the powers which were exclusively the prerogative of states under the Constitution are shifted to the new federal government. And so ultimately, several of the Federalist Papers and much of the controversy once the new government goes into operation tends to focus around the balance of power between the states and the federal government. We know, for example, that by mid-century, by the middle of the 19th century, the nation is going to be torn between North and South. Obviously on the issue of slavery, but constitutionally on the issue of the proper balance between state power and federal power. And many of the southern states begin to adopt and advocate the very familiar position of states' rights. And they begin to actively argue that while the federal government assumes some of the powers of the states, as the states held those powers under the Articles of Confederation, the transition of power from state to federal government was not complete. In other words, the states didn't give up or surrender all of their power to the central government, so consequently the debate continues to surface over how much. In other words, establishing a proper balance in the new federal system. And so what we're talking about here is the overall meaning of the idea of federalism, the balance between state power and federal power. And we also know that many of the questions associated with federalism, associated with this balance between state and federal power, are going to end up being resolved by the Supreme Court. And as we know, in 1801, before he leaves office, President Adams, John Adams, appoints John Marshall as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. That's one of the so-called midnight appointments, if you will. Adams is renowned in the textbooks for the so-called last-minute appointments during that interim period between the election of Jefferson and the inauguration of Jefferson. And as we know, under the Constitution, the inauguration doesn't happen until March, whereas the election happens in November. So early on in the nation's history, there's a 4-month gap between the election and the swearing in of the new government. We know that in a later amendment to the Constitution, that March inauguration is pushed back into January. We know, for example, that currently our presidents who are elected in November are inaugurated in January. But originally it was in March. So during that period, John Adams is president of the United States, but he's lame duck. He's outgoing. He's lost the election to Jefferson. And during that period, Adams makes a number of appointments. One of them is John Marshall as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Kind of a lasting legacy, kind of a finger in the eye, as it were, to the incoming President Thomas Jefferson. Even though Marshall and Jefferson are cousins, they aren't kissing cousins, if that makes any sense. Anyway, back to the point that I was going to make about Jefferson as Secretary of State. Initially, the office was the Secretary of Foreign Affairs. But one of the issues that surfaces during discussions within the administration, and this is primarily in the person of Alexander Hamilton, is the proper role for government envisioned by Hamilton and the degree to which Jefferson takes issue with it. One of the proposals, for example, early on in the discussions within the Washington administration is the idea of an additional secretary, a Secretary of Domestic Affairs. So in other words, while we would have a Secretary of Foreign Affairs, we would also have a Secretary of Domestic Affairs. And the idea of appointing a Secretary of Domestic Affairs would be to oversee and manage government in its pursuit of some of the domestic initiatives that were considered to be legitimate parts of in the purview of the new government. And among those was government's role as manager or initiator of a number of domestic initiatives, like, for example, government promoting and encouraging inventions, the creation of corporations, patent laws, protecting inventions, protecting creativity as the property of the inventor or the creator. In other words, Hamilton sees the proper role of government as taking an active role in promoting certain domestic initiatives or priorities. And for that, he advocates the creation of a Secretary of Domestic Affairs. The compromise on that issue is to change the name of the Secretary of Foreign Affairs to the Secretary of State, on the assumption that many of those domestic initiatives would come under the purview of the Secretary of State's office. Of course, it's interesting because that the Secretary of State is going to be Thomas Jefferson, and philosophically, ideologically, Thomas Jefferson is not one who endorses that kind of role, that kind of active, visible role of government being so directly involved in all domestic aspects of the economy. And so even though theoretically domestic issues, domestic initiatives would fall under the purview of the Secretary of State, under his office, the fact of the matter is not much happens early on, because Jefferson is the Secretary of State, and Jefferson philosophically doesn't subscribe to the view, the political views, if you will, of Alexander Hamilton. But I think that issue of the emergence of the Secretary of State's office is significant. One of the things we're going to see, for example, is that 30 years later, when John Quincy Adams is elected President of the United States in 1824, John Quincy Adams is an advocate of the same Hamiltonian idea of a very active, visible, aggressive, fingers in every pie type of role for the federal government. In his inaugural address, for example, John Quincy Adams in early 1825, when he's inaugurated, talks about the federal government promoting or encouraging science, encouraging education, moving forward with the idea of the creation of a national university. In other words, government being directly involved in education, in research, in science, in all of these things. That's the same position Hamilton advocated at the very beginning. But the appointment of Jefferson pretty well nips some of that in the bud for a while, and it's not until Adams's administration in the mid-1820s that the same debate resurfaces. I think, though, that why this is significant for us to at least be aware of is that it gives us an indication of what Hamilton's financial recommendations are going to be about, or what those financial recommendations are going to include. It's very obvious from Hamilton's position in support of the creation of a Secretary of Domestic Affairs that Hamilton believes in a very visible, a very active, a very dynamic government administration. He wants government involved in everything. And of course, this, if you recall, and go all the way back to the debate there in the convention over the Constitution itself, when Hamilton takes the floor early in June of 1787 and makes that day-long 5-hour speech on the floor of the convention in which he praises the value of the British Constitution and begins to lay out a role for government which was very, very aristocratic, very authoritarian from the very beginning. It's very clear right away that Hamilton's whole approach is a government that is as strong as it's possible to get away with. Hamilton does not believe that it's possible to have a government that is too strong. Hamilton is an advocate of monarchy. He believes in monarchy as the ideal political form. That's why he supports the British Constitution, because it retains the monarchy. So when Hamilton becomes a supporter of the Constitution, he's doing so recognizing that the Constitution, in his view, is the most we can hope to get in this country, given its commitment to republicanism and given its commitment to popular government. So there's no question, there should be no surprise, that when the new government begins, once the Constitution is ratified, Hamilton's behavior, his vision, his priorities, everything points in the direction of a visible, aggressive, dynamic federal government. So in other words, what initiative what proactiveness there is in the new government is the responsibility of Hamilton. And almost from the very beginning, Jefferson and of course in Congress, Madison, find themselves doing everything they can do to put the brakes on this. And I think we'll see why once we look at the details of Hamilton's financial program. On last Wednesday, when we were together, I laid out in very general form the ingredients of Hamilton's program, and then we started to go back and look at each one in detail. Hamilton's program, if you look at it, really has, most textbooks tell us, there are 5 parts to Hamilton's program. I think the idea of the Office of Domestic Affairs actually suggests that the overall program could involve more than that. But there are 5 specific pieces of legislation that come out of Hamilton's office that speak particularly to his role as Secretary of the Treasury. The first 2, and this is all we got to in our program last Wednesday, the first 2 are connected in that they are 2 aspects of the same thing, and that is funding the debt. And again, this is very confusing. I don't know. I'm sure there are many of you listening who probably understand more about the economy than I do. I'm not an economist. And I must say that much of my understanding of the economy comes from the perspective of doing research as a developing historian. I never took a specific course in economics, either as an undergraduate or as a graduate student. Most of what I learned about the economy, I've learned because I had to know it in order to understand what was happening politically. And so much of what I have concluded over the years might be contradictory or contrary to what many of those with an economics background might believe and might have learned. And for that, I apologize. All I want you to do is recognize where I'm coming from. I'm not an economist. But I have spent a lot of time over the years trying to get a handle on and understand Hamilton's program. I can share with you that when I first went to graduate school and began reading books about the Washington administration and about the emergence of political parties in the early 1790s, I was very confused by Hamilton's program. I found it very difficult to understand because I really didn't understand the nature of the economy in toto. And much of what I've come to understand about it is the product of struggling with Hamilton's program. So with that kind of qualification then, let me go in recognizing that the way I would explain these things is the way they make the most sense to me. And I'm perfectly open to questions and comments and criticisms and additions and corrections and all the rest of it, because I don't claim to have the kind of expertise in this particular area that I'd like to have. It seems to me, though, that funding and assumption, funding of the national debt and assuming the state debts, the first 2 parts of Hamilton's 5-part program, are clearly related. They are the same thing. They just apply to different debt, national debt versus the debts held by the states. And this debt goes back to the debt incurred by the nation under the Articles of Confederation. The loans that the nation made in order to fight for its independence. The money that it was borrowing from the Dutch, from France, from nations who did everything they can do to promote and encourage American independence, obviously because for them it was a way to weaken the power of the British Empire. So naturally, France would do everything that it can do to encourage discord and division within the British Empire. And therefore, France entered into the very famous Treaty of Alliance with the colonies, with the Congress, in 1778 during the war itself. And one of the major political issues of the 1790s revolves around whether, in fact, that Treaty of Alliance between the United States and France still exists. Even though the French government has changed as a result of the French Revolution in the late 1780s and early 1790s, those in France believe that the treaty was never rescinded, and that consequently the United States has an obligation to come in as an ally of France should France end up at war with England. And in the 1790s, that appears to be just what's going to happen. And France naturally assumes that it has a ready-made ally in the United States. So when the United States adopts a position of neutrality between England and France in the war in Europe, for the United States government under President Washington to declare neutrality is to violate or to contradict the terms of the Treaty of 1778 if you assume that it's still in force. And France argues that it is. And the Jeffersonians, the supporters of Jefferson, argue that it is because they are supporters of France in its struggles with England. Hamilton, of course, who made the very impassioned speech on the floor of the convention about the beauty of the British system, of the British Constitution, Hamilton is an ally and supporter of the British. So his major argument to President Washington is that since the government that exists in France is not the same government that was there when the alliance of 1778 was enacted, was completed, then consequently the change in governments in France negates the treaty. And so you have a situation where the Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, is arguing to the president that we should honor the Treaty of 1778. And you have the Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, arguing just the opposite. And when President Washington makes the decision on neutrality in that particular position, it's not a victory for Hamilton per se, but it's pretty much a defeat for Jefferson. And I think that's very, very significant. So the differences, if you will, between Hamilton and Jefferson, the differences in perspective and philosophy and ideology which are existent in the Washington administration surface very quickly and very early. and they become increasingly more pronounced as the 1790s go on. To the point, by the time we get to 1793, that Jefferson feels his best move is to leave the administration and to resign as Secretary of State. So the first two portions of Hamilton's program are to fund the national debt and to assume the state debts. And what that means is the new government would become the holder of all the outstanding debt that existed prior to the ratification of the Constitution, whether it be national or whether it be state. The numbers are, I think, significant in terms of what the size of that debt is. But I think we all have to realize that we've come a long way since then, and that the numbers that people throw around now, which are tens of millions and billions and trillions and all the rest of it, are going to make this debt look small as far as the debt of a nation is concerned. But I think what we have to do is put this in perspective and realize that this is in 1789, 1790. That this is a brand new government. And this totals, or this funding idea, is intended to put the new government into deep debt almost from the very beginning of the nation's existence, the government's existence. And that's the significance, rather than the actual size of the debt itself. You see sometimes different numbers, but the numbers tend to be more precise, because with the new Constitution, with the creation of the federal government under the Constitution, we now begin to have hard data. The new government keeps records. And so it's possible to go right into the records and extract the data. So these numbers are not approximations, they're absolute numbers that historians have been able to extract. Once the new government goes into existence, the responsibility of the new government financially falls into the hands of the Secretary of State, Alexander Hamilton. And Hamilton is asked by Congress to make recommendations as to what the new government intends to do in order to establish fiscal responsibility for the new government, for the new nation. Not only for purposes of balancing books and all the rest of it, but also for purposes of conducting foreign affairs. The nations of the world that exist at that time call for positive relations by the United States in conducting affairs and being recognized by the other nations as a legitimate nation, as a legitimate government. And so many people realize that if the United States is going to be recognized as legitimate, then it's going to have to stand for and demonstrate its commitment to fiscal responsibility. So Congress immediately looks to the Secretary of State and requests recommendations, requests a series of reports on what the new administration recommends in order to create this idea of fiscal responsibility. And I'm reading directly from, and this is from a textbook, and the author of this particular section is Pauline Maier, who's one of the more noted. She just died very recently. Pauline Maier is one of the more respected historians in this early period. Just before she died, which I believe is about 2 years ago, Pauline Maier authored a book, her last book, which was entitled Ratification. And it goes through the various states looking at the ratification struggle. And it's about a 650-page, 700-page book. And it was the last publication that Pauline Maier was able to do before she passed. Anyway, in this particular textbook, these numbers are hers. It wasn't but 10 days after Hamilton became Secretary of State that the House of Representatives asked him to prepare a plan for supporting the public credit. Based on that, in January, the following January, 1790, Hamilton submitted his first report on the public credit. This was the first of 4 reports that he prepared for Congress. The first one then, January of 1790. A second report produced by Hamilton focuses on the creation of a national bank. That report is issued or comes out of the Secretary of the Treasury's office in December of 1790. A third report on the creation or the establishment of the United States Mint is issued in January of 1791, the month after the report on the National Bank. The fourth report on American manufacturing is published on December 1791. So basically what we have here is Congress's request for a plan in September of 1789. 10 days after Hamilton is appointed by Washington and approved as Secretary of the Treasury. And Hamilton immediately begins to issue a series of reports to Congress. And it's the sum total of these reports that constitute his plan. The first report deals with funding and assumption. The second report deals with a bank. The third report deals with the mint, the actual printing of money, of currency. And the fourth report deals with the government's role in promoting or encouraging American manufacturing. And Hamilton's proposals for each of them become the ingredients of his financial program. Here are the numbers that Pauline Maier gives us on the size of the debt to be funded. She said that the size of the national debt, the debt owed to foreign nations, is $11,710,378. I mean, obviously, we don't need to worry about the details. $11,700,000, let's say. The domestic debt, that's the money owed to foreign nations. The money that the Congress, the central government, the Continental Congress, under the Articles, owed domestically was $44,400,000. So the total national debt to be funded is $44,400,000 plus $11,700,000. So that's a little bit over $56 million. 44.4 and 11.7. 44 and 11 is 55. The 7 and the 4 together is another million. So a little bit over $56 million is to be funded under the funding proposal. But later on in that report, first report on the public credit, Hamilton recommends as well that the state debts be assumed, that the new government also take on the responsibility of the money owed by each state under the Confederation. And that totaled another $25 million. So what you're looking at is $56 million plus $25 million, which is a little bit over $80 million for a government that barely has been in existence long enough for people to hang up their coats, if that makes sense. In other words, Hamilton is recommending that right out of the chute, the new government take on a debt obligation in excess of $80 million. So the question then is this sound fiscal policy? Does this make sense? After all, Hamilton has been recognized and has gone down in history as a financial genius. But the fact of the matter is, there's evidence to suggest that that reputation as a financial genius may not really be warranted. Let me give you a couple of examples. Which I think will make this clear. Hamilton's Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, Oliver Wolcott, he replaces Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury in 1795. Wolcott leaves evidence to suggest that Hamilton's proposals were anything but financially sound. Wolcott says the following: our foreign resources are dried up. This is what what Wolcott says when he takes over from Hamilton in 1795. Our foreign resources are dried up. Our domestic resources are deeply anticipated, at least as respects the bank. Banks are multiplying like mushrooms, Wolcott says. The prices of all our exports are impaired by paper negotiations and unfounded projects, so that no foreign market will indemnify the shippers. Our commerce is harassed by the war. Our internal revenue unproductive of the expected sums, owing to prejudice, combination, and the want of competent officers. Usury absorbs much of the capital which might be calculated upon as a resource if visionary speculations could be destroyed. In other words, when he becomes Secretary of the Treasury after Hamilton leaves in 1795, and let me tell you that when Hamilton leaves in 1795, it's because he has been accused and charged by the House of Representatives for malfeasance in office, for abusing the office of the Secretary of the Treasury. In other words, much of this program has come into question between the time it was proposed in the early 90s and 1795, when the House, primarily under the leadership of James Madison, passes a motion of censure on the Secretary of the Treasury, which finally causes him to leave office. Walcott's letter here basically says, to put it into layman's terms, the finances of this country are a mess. Nobody respects us. There's fraud. There's accusations or charges of fraud. Bills aren't being paid. Our businessmen are not being respected around the world. Banks are multiplying like mushrooms. The value of our currency is being questioned. In other words, what Walcott is effectively saying is the finances of this country are a damn mess. I think that this is one of the most eye-opening, important statements in this entire period. Hamilton's response to Oliver Walcott is the following, quote, "The worst evil we can struggle with is inefficiency in the measures of government." Hamilton said, quote, "The considerations of expense are of no moment compared with the advantages of energy," unquote. What Hamilton is saying to Walcott is the real issues associated with this program, funding and assumption, really don't have anything at all to do with economics. They have everything to do with politics. The issue here is the power of government. The program is designed to enhance that power. Its purpose is not economic, it's political. So therefore, it's necessary to go back and look at Hamilton's funding and assumption from the perspective of what this tells us about the political motives of Alexander Hamilton in the report on public credit that he issues to Congress in 1790, in which he makes recommendations for funding and assumption so that the new government will assume or take on a debt in excess of $80 million. First, funding. When the funding proposal is taken up in Congress, it's important to recognize that nobody takes issue with it, because everybody expects that if the new government is to earn respect from nations overseas, then it has to make good on its financial obligations. It has to pay its debts. So the funding of the national debt, 44.4 and 11.7, $56 million, is not really that controversial. What is controversial is the fact that many people who own this debt, the creditors, the people who own the debt, which means they possess the IOUs or the certificates, which they are going to bring to the newly created federal offices. And they're going to hand these certificates to federal agents. And in the account books, representatives of the federal government are going to enter the date, the name and address of the holder of the debt, and the face amount of the certificate. In other words, what is the dollar amount of debt that this particular certificate is valued at? And then the new government is going to issue new certificates on that face amount, which is going to carry interest, annual interest. And it's the sum total of all of that debt, all those certificates added up, that gives us the total of $56 million for the national, funding the national debt. In other words, the Federal Account Office, the records show that under Hamilton's funding proposal, $56 million plus in certificates were registered under the funding plan. But Hamilton, and so the question that emerges is, that's all well and good, but is it fair when we know that many of the people who bring in the certificates, who own the debt, aren't the ones who originally owned it? In other words, they aren't the one whose name is on the certificate. Originally, the national debt, the certificate was written, the IOU was written to a different person. But what has happened is that many people have found it lucrative to speculate in the national debt. In other words, to buy up as many of these certificates as they could get their hands on. But here's the kicker. The only reason that a speculator could buy a certificate at a good price, at a profit, is if the person selling the certificate didn't know that the new government was going to make good on the face value of the certificate. In other words, the original owner of the certificate was in the dark. Basically, what these people would say to themselves is, I got this damn certificate that I've had for years that's not worth the money it's printed on. It's not worth the price of the paper it's printed on. Because none of the government, under the Articles of Confederation, which couldn't tax, what that meant was that these people, year after year, never got paid. And so with every year that went by, the real value of the certificate depreciated. They became worth less and less. So if somebody comes along after all of this time and offers to give you 25% of the face value of the certificates, hard money, in many cases, most of these people would take it and say, hell, a quarter on the dollar is better than nothing. So I better take what I can get while I can get it. This program then creates a fabulous opportunity for speculators. Those people in the know, those people who knew that the Hamilton program was going to involve funding the debt at face value plus interest, and using that information to go out and buy up as much of the debt as they could get their hands on before the word became public, before the general public became aware of what the new government was doing. It's called insider trading. Only certain people knew what was going on. They were friends of Hamilton's. People that he was in contact with, businessmen, for example. Evidence? One of the most notorious speculators in this period, prominent businessman and financier, is named Andrew Craigie, C-R-A-I-G-I-E. Andrew Craigie. He's a Boston financier. He lives in Boston. In December 89 into early 1790, when the funding bill is being debated in Congress, Andrew Craigie moves from Boston to New York. He wants to be where the action is. And so he gets a room in a rooming house with 6 members of Congress from New England, so that he can follow day to day the progress of the funding bill through Congress. He lives with 6 members of Congress while he's in New York. And he writes the following to one of his partners back in Boston. He says, besides, there are many who are interested in delaying this business. In other words, postponing the funding bill, the vote, either because they've borrowed large sums of the debt, which they have to purchase, or because their private arrangements are not in readiness for speculation. In other words, what Craigie is reporting is that many members of Congress want the bill postponed for a while in order to give them time to go back and take advantage of it before they pass it. In other words, to engage in a little bit of speculation themselves. So what's the result? Of the 64 members of Congress who support funding and assumption, 29 of them directly profited from the legislation they passed. The names of 29 members of Congress who voted for this legislation are on the federal account books for turning in certificates. There's the politics. When Hamilton says to Walcott, in response to Walcott's financial concerns about the overall program, Hamilton's saying to Walcott, you missed the boat, guy. Don't worry about it. The issue here is not economics. It's energy in government. It's political. So the question is, where's the politics here? What's the political realities of funding and later on of assumption of the state debts, an additional $25 million for which the states were responsible? What's the politics? The politics is giving certain people the financial incentive to support the new government by buying their loyalty. So you look at the $81 million in debt, And you say to yourself, my God, this raises serious questions about finances. I mean, to take a brand new government and saddle it with $81 million in debt before they even get off the ground doesn't seem to be fiscally sound. And then when Hamilton is confronted with that, he said the issue is not economic anyway. It's political. And the answer is, what he's doing in the funding program is buying the loyalty of certain people. And I think you need to be able to make a few very logical, obvious conclusions here. And the first is speculation. Who can speculate and who can't? Let me give you an example, a personal example. If somebody knocked on my front door right now and said to me, I've got parked right in front of your home, right in front of your house right now, your front door, I've got a new 2016 Cadillac. You can have this Cadillac for $10,000 right now. If you give me $10,000, you own this Cadillac, which is valued at what? I was looking at the paper this weekend on some of the car sales, and I happened to look at this. Some of the new Cadillacs book for, the so-called suggested retail price, $74,000, $76,000. So here's somebody at my door saying, we'll give you a $76,000 car for $10,000. I couldn't do it because I don't have $10,000. So the reality here is who does have $10,000? Damn few people. Or let me be a little bit more specific. Certain people can lay their hands on that kind of money. Most people can't. And what that means is only certain people can speculate successfully. Because only certain people have the hard cash that they need to buy up the certificates, even if they are 25 cents on the dollar. You got to have the 25 cents. But if you're going into the business of speculation, it doesn't do you any good to buy $10 worth. You got to be able to buy $10,000 worth. And so if you look at the federal account books under Hamilton's program, people were turning in huge amounts of money. Certificates valued at $25,000, $30,000, $40,000. Which means that even though they were getting these for maybe a quarter or a third of their face value, $40,000 in certificates meant that you had to have had $10,000 in cash to do it. And only a very, very few people have that kind of money available to them. So the reality is only a few people are able to benefit directly from the opportunities that speculation presents. But now we get to the question, who are these people? It's not me. I can't buy the damn Cadillac. It's well-connected, prominent, financially active investors, financiers, businessmen, bankers, lawyers. Who are these people? Where do they live? Well, if you look at the structure of the United States at the time we're talking about, 1789, 1790, most of these people are businessmen located in the cities. Boston, Providence, Newport, Hartford, New York, Trenton, Camden, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Annapolis. But if you look at the map, there aren't that many big cities south of that. Oh, there's Charleston and there's Norfolk and Alexandria that is growing pretty fast. But the fact of the matter is, most of the financial punch, most of the financial power in the nation is in the Northeast. It's in urban areas. It's in the cities. That's where the banks are. That's where the banking action is happening. That's where the financial investor opportunities are. That's where the shipping business is located. That's where the insurance business is located. In other words, whatever financial business activity and potential there is in the country is sectional in nature. Most of it is located in the east, and most of it is located north of the Potomac. So if you look at it, put yourself in the position of James Madison for a minute. He's a member of Congress from Virginia. And he looks at the funding bill. What's going to be his reaction to it? He's going to say, and he does, I don't have a problem with funding the national debt. I mean, we have to establish our credibility in the world. Other nations have to respect us for our fiscal integrity and all those other terms. I don't have a problem with that. But I do have a problem with the speculation and the opportunities for speculation that this particular legislation presents. I don't think it's right that the holders of the debt, the certificates, the people who turn them in, ought to get face value. I think the name on the certificate, the person who was originally issued the certificate, is the one who should get the benefit of the legislation. I think we have to do something to discriminate between the original holders of the debt and speculators. And Hamilton comes up with all sorts of counter arguments to argue that that would make the process so complicated and so endless that it wouldn't work. That it may on the surface seem fair, but it would be a financial mess. It would be a nightmare. It would be a bureaucratic nightmare. And Hamilton is able to argue down those who support discrimination between the original holders of the debt and speculators in the debt. And the funding bill passes as Hamilton wrote it. But, and this is a big but, the assumption of state debts is a different issue. And what makes it a different issue is that certain states hold more of the debt than other states. If you look at the fiscal history of the 13 states under the Confederation, it becomes very clear that certain states are very fiscally responsible, while it appears that others are not. Most of the outstanding state debt is owed by northern states. Most of the southern states have paid off their Revolutionary War debt. So what that means is that if assumption passes, it clearly benefits certain states, but it doesn't benefit the other states. In other words, the fiscally responsible states, the ones that paid their obligations, are now being asked to help pay off the debt of the states who didn't pay off their debts. And so Madison and many of the other congressmen from the South look at assumption and say, where the hell should we pay off Massachusetts' debt and Pennsylvania's debt and Vermont, and New Hampshire's debt, New York's debt, and all that? We paid ours. If they didn't pay theirs, that's their problem. Why the heck should our citizens be burdened with their debt? And so the assumption bill, the first time it comes before Congress, it fails. And the vote is really sectional. And what I mean is most of the states that vote against the assumption bill are southern states. Most of the states, naturally, who vote for the assumption are the northern states who stand to benefit from it. In other words, in these states, their debt is being taken over by the new government. So you begin to look at the breakdown on assumption. In the northern states, the states north of the Potomac, the vote on assumption, and this is in the Senate, 24-9 in favor of assumption. So in the northern states, 36 senators vote. And the vote is 24-9 in favor of assumption. But in the southern states, the vote is 10-18 against the assumption bill. In other words, 18 southern states vote against it, whereas only 10 positive votes. So the point is that the nation is beginning to split between North and South already. This is in 1790. And we wonder why there was a civil war? It is absolutely astounding that the split over Hamilton's program is increasingly becoming sectional. And increasingly, Jefferson and Madison are beginning to act more as Southerners, as Virginians, than they are, seemingly, as Americans. I think there's a few conclusions to be drawn from this information. And I think the most important conclusion is that there's absolutely no question that the emergence of the two-party system in America, the emergence of modern political parties in America, begins in reaction to Hamilton's fiscal or financial program. There's no question. There's no question that with the ratification of the Constitution, and especially with the adoption of the Bill of Rights, most of the opposition to the Constitution has disappeared. It appears that parties, if you consider the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists who disagreed, who differed, and fought over the Constitution, if you label them parties rather than just factions, then whatever parties there were over the Constitution pretty much disappeared with ratification, especially with the adoption of the Bill of Rights. So the fact that you get sectional votes like the vote on assumption suggests that the emergence of two parties in America is being driven by Hamilton's financial program, by the apparent sectional nature of that program. It clearly appears that Hamilton's program is designed principally to appeal to business and financial interests in the Northeast, in the cities. It appears that the program is discriminating against agriculture. It's discriminating against the South. It's discriminating against planters. It's discriminating against small farmers in the West. Theoretically, it's discriminating against the little people. And it's designed to benefit the big people. On the surface, it appears to be a program aimed primarily at rewarding the few at the expense of the many. And if you go back to Hamilton's response to Oliver Wolcott, one is forced to conclude that that is exactly what Hamilton is doing. Hamilton is buying the loyalty and buying the support of the people that he believes necessary in order to guarantee the success of the new nation. How's he buying it? With the funding and assumption proposals. Because the argument obviously is, from the fiscally naive like me, my argument would be, hell, $81 million, no way in the world can the new government afford to pay that. And Hamilton's response is, that's the point. We don't want to pay it. As long as we owe it, the people who we are paying interest to will continue to support us. So Hamilton's position is, as long as we pay the interest, we don't care if we ever get the damn thing paid off. Because as long as the new federal government is paying certain financial and business interests for their support, we will continue to be able to count on that support. So the serious question then is whether in fact Hamilton's fiscal program is a financial program at all, or whether in fact it's a highly sophisticated, intricate, rather insidious political program aimed primarily at rewarding the few at the expense of the many. The posting that I put on the Facebook page last Friday, I believe, included the following quote. In a letter from Gouverneur Morris of New York, Pennsylvania, New York went to Pennsylvania, businessman. Gouverneur Morris to John Jay writes the following. Finance, my friend, all that is left of the American Revolution grounds there, unquote. Translation, Gouverneur Morris is saying to John Jay, hey buddy, when the smoke clears, when the dust settles, this is what it's all about. So let me, for a moment, because we haven't finished the assumption issue yet, but let me raise an issue for a moment that gets us out of the 18th century and begins to examine some of these things in light of the 21st century. Citizens United in 2010. The Supreme Court decision that allows unlimited amounts of money under the guise of of speech to pour into our election system, and thereby to buy influence with political candidates. What many people will say is the most unfair, un-American Supreme Court decision. John Roberts and the court that approved this should rot in hell for a Supreme Court decision that effectively destroys the American system of democracy. By giving the people with money the opportunity to buy influence in government, by funding campaigns, and buying the loyalty of certain individuals whose campaign they are willing to fund. So as we look at the ongoing political campaigns in both parties, we begin to look at some of the candidates and the bankrolls that are available to them as the political campaign goes on. For example, the amount of financial contributions that have come into the campaign of Hillary Clinton. The fact that Hillary Clinton is sitting on some of the largest total campaign commitments, contributions that exist. At Jeb Bush, who despite the fact that he's only attracting, depending on which poll you look at, 5%, 6%, 8%, 9% of Republicans. We know has a war chest in excess of $100 million. Just this weekend, for example, we notice that Jeb Bush has had to make some fiscal cutbacks in his campaign. He's had to lay off some people and reduce some salaries. Not only do we know it, but all we have to do is listen to Donald Trump, who talked about it on this morning's Today Show, and pointed out that this weekend Jeb went back to Texas to spend the weekend with mommy and daddy in order to make some hard fiscal decisions about his campaign. Because the fact of the matter is, even though he's got access to all of this money, he doesn't seem to be moving in the polls. And he's the subject of the talk of Donald Trump. And then we look at the campaign of Bernie Sanders, who from the very beginning has refused to accept PAC money, big money. He's refused to allow his campaign to benefit from Citizens United. In fact, he is committed, if he is elected president, to overturn that decision and do everything he can do to get this big money out of our political system in order to purify our democratic system and theoretically bring it back to where it ought to be before it was despoiled and destroyed by the Roberts Court. And one of the other things that it seems to me we begin to see in this political campaign, and I put a posting on Facebook a few days ago that just threw this out there for consideration, is that if you look at the poll rankings, the numbers in the Republican Party, you find that for a long time Donald Trump was number one in everything, in every poll. But that number two was Ben Carson. And that increasingly in recent weeks, Ben Carson's numbers have been going up to the point that he and Trump became very close. And only this weekend do we see evidence of a few polls that indicate that Ben Carson in some areas has overcome the lead that Donald Trump has had for so long, and that Ben Carson is now in the forefront in Iowa, and is closing in New Hampshire, and may be closing or leading in South Carolina, and on and on and on. And what we find that Donald Trump and Ben Carson have in common, despite the fact that they are different candidates, is the fact that neither one of them are considered to be politicians. In other words, if you take them both together, then what that is telling us is that half of the Republican voters are threatening to vote for non-politicians, for people who've not been in office before. People that aren't tainted by the political shenanigans that bother so many people. And then you look just before Donald Trump and Ben Carson, and who do you see in third and fourth place? Carly Fiorina, who's not a politician either. In fact, she is the ousted CEO of Hewlett-Packard. She's third. Who's fourth? Marco Rubio, who, while he's a senator, is only in his first term. Really doesn't have much of a political record to run on, or from the other side of the aisle, doesn't have much of a political record to run against, other than the political record he's establishing right now, which is the fact that since he became a candidate for president, he's missing almost all the votes. He rarely votes because he's on the road trying to be president. What keeps him in the race? The fact that he's got one financial supporter who's bankrolling his campaign and keeping him in the race under Citizens United. I saw the name, but I can't remember it, and it's not a name I recognize. And then you think back to the last election, And if you remember in the last presidential election, when in 2012, when President Obama was reelected to his second term, and you think back to the Republican campaign, up to the very end, one of the candidates who seemingly was able to hang in the race, even though he wasn't gathering a whole lot of political support, was Newt Gingrich. And lo and behold, we find that the reason Newt Gingrich was able to stay in the race for as long as he did, is because he had the support of the Chicago casino owner, Adelson, the supporter of Israel, who has so much influence and so much power that in the 2012 campaign, he was able to call all the Republican candidates to Chicago and personally interview each one of them in order to make sure that they took the right position on Israel. And I seem to remember an instance where Gingrich made a mistake in one of his presentations and made reference to the fact that the West Bank was occupied territory, which is, of course, exactly what Adelson doesn't want the West Bank labeled as. So, as I recall, Gingrich was required to have a special audience with Adelson in order to affirm his commitment to Israel and the fact that this was a slip of the tongue, da-da-da-da-da-da. And the result was that Gingrich was able to stay in the race for the nomination long after one would think that he would be driven from the race and would have had to withdraw. What we are seeing is the role that big money, the relationship between money and power, political power, has in and on our political decision making. On who we elect, on who runs, on who has a chance, on who can withstand, who can stay in the race, who can't, and obviously what positions these particular financial interests are able to wield in terms of what positions and what votes they're able to count on key issues. The example that I used was Adelson, I think it was Adelson, and the Israeli question. The point is, going all the way back to the Hamilton regime under President Washington in 1789 and 1790, Hamilton's fiscal program, right out of the chute, was designed to appeal to big money and to the financial interests of this country. The fact that most of those financial interests were located in the Northeast creates a sectional overtone to this, which is very significant given the fact that 70 years after, the nation is going to be caught up in the most terrible civil war in its history. A war that is predominantly sectional. There's absolutely no question that the sectional divisions within the nation are there from the very beginning. It is these sectional considerations that forced Thomas Jefferson to redact from the Declaration of Independence all he had written about slavery and the slave trade. It was sectional considerations that threatened over and over again to break up the Constitutional Convention in the summer of 1787 unless concessions were made to the slaveholding South. Consequently, the Constitution of the United States, as it's originally written and passed, acknowledges and ratifies the existence of slavery in this country. There is a compromise reached on the distribution of votes and how the slave population will count in determining population in southern states in order to determine their voting power in the House of Representatives. And the result of that, this difference, of course, is the famous 3/5 compromise. There's also the compromise in the Constitution about the slave trade. The Constitution predicts or mandates the end of the slave trade, but it won't happen for 20 years. In other words, the Constitution is ratified in 1788. Nothing can be done with the slave trade until 1808, which is, of course, during the administration of Thomas Jefferson. The Constitution reflects all sorts of compromises, sectional compromises, that were necessary in order to get the Declaration of Independence approved, in order to get the Constitution of the United States approved. There's absolutely no question then, I would suggest, that the Civil War is testimony to one of the most abject failures that this political system has ever experienced in its history. The fact that we received all of these warning signs early on that we had to do something, we had to find a way to deal with the sectional differences that were existent in this nation, and the fact that we were unable to solve them, that what we did instead is continually reach compromises on them. Our whole history for our kids in grade school, our history classes have become the sum total, it seems, of memorizing compromise after compromise after compromise on the sectional differences between North and South. The Missouri Compromise, the Slave Trade Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the compromise there. The fact that one of our nation's most prominent senators, Henry Clay, goes down in history as the great compromiser because of his ability to get things done in Congress at the expense of the sectional realities that exist. What we see then at the very beginning of the histories of the nation's history under the Constitution is the surfacing of this same sectionalism as reflected in opposition to Hamilton's program. And with but a few minutes left in today's program, because my clock says right now we're at 53 minutes after the hour, so we've got about 4 minutes left in today's program, I'd like to return to the assumption issue again. and make sure that before we leave today, we can get the assumption bill passed. Because if you recall, when we were talking about assumption about 30 minutes ago, we pointed out that the assumption bill, when it first came up in Congress, because most of the southern states had already paid their debts, and it was most of the northern New England states that had not, resulted in defeat of the assumption bill. Hamilton goes to Thomas Jefferson, his fellow member of the Washington administration, and makes the point that his entire program will be ruined if assumption doesn't pass. And he's making an appeal to Jefferson as a Southerner. He's obviously making an appeal that Jefferson will be able to use his influence with certain Southern delegates to get them to change their votes in order to get the assumption bill passed. It just so happens that one of the major issues that is being debated in Congress at the same time as Hamilton's financial program is legislation regarding the location of the national capital. If you look back through the Revolution, through the War for Independence itself, it's very clear that early on in the nation's history, even before independence is won, Jefferson and Washington and the others are beginning to recognize that once we become independent, where we put the national capital will determine the future of that section of the nation. Obviously, New England would love to have the national capital because that's where the people are, that's where the financial action is, all of it. But they know from past experience that the South will never stand for that. Obviously, the South would love to have the national capital. Wouldn't it be great, many Southerners believe, if Charleston, South Carolina, became the national capital? But hell, let's be realistic. Would Boston, would Massachusetts, and New York stand for the national capital to be located in Charleston? These hot, humid summers in the South? Who could stand it? Realistically, it occurs to most people that the decision on where the national capital is going to be is going to suggest that it be located somewhere in the middle, somewhere that's not too far north, but somewhere that's not too far south either. And immediately in the early 1780s, different communities, different cities begin to jockey and lobby for the national capital. There's a proposal that it be located in New York. There's a proposal that it be located in Philadelphia. There's a proposal that it be located in Camden, New Jersey, between the two. Many people believe that New Jersey's ideal because it sits right between Philadelphia and New York. But what about the southern states? They begin to meet on the national capital, and they begin to argue that if we all vote together maybe we can influence where the national capital is. And so the decision that the Southern delegates reach is realistically, how far south do we really think we've got a chance to locate the national capital? And the decision is the Potomac. Chances are the furthest south that we've got a realistic chance to land the capital is on the Potomac River. The assumption deadlock in Congress makes it possible to pull off one of the biggest deals in the history of the nation. We have less than 1 minute left in today's program. We will be back tomorrow. I remind you, 1.5 hours later at 1:30. And it won't be hard to remember where we left off. The national capital deal. It's unbelievable.